Gumba Malgun, Gumba Nanigi Anindu, which is good evening. It's good to see you here in Burragum, which is the language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. I am Vicky McDonald, State Librarian and Chief Executive Officer here at the State Library of Queensland. I begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. We are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. Welcome to Plants and People, the art of living together. This is the fourth talk in our series, proudly presented in partnership with The Conversation, the world's leading free, fact-based news source, written by academics and edited by journalists. State Library's latest exhibition is Entwined, Plants and People. Expertly curated by our specialist staff, it features historical illustrations, art, objects, and digital stories about our connection to the natural world. Entwined is in the SLQ Gallery here at Southbank, but you can also view some of the extraordinary works and listen to the digital stories on our website. This evening, we turn to experts in the fields of botany, design, and conservation to help us understand this complex, symbiotic relationship. Wherever you are, I invite you to join into the conversation via the live stream chat, Twitter or Facebook. It is now my pleasure to introduce your chair for this evening, Dr. Eddie Game. Thank you and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Vicky. Hello and welcome to the State Library of Queensland. I'm Eddie Game, lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy and editor-in-chief of the journal Conservation Letters. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I and my panellists are speaking from, the Jagera and Turrbal people here in Brisbane, the Gadigal in New South Wales, the Whadjuk Noongar in Western Australia, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Our lives are and have always been entwined with plants. The very conditions on this planet that make Earth's remarkable diversity of life possible are due to plants. Plants perform the incredible trick of turning sunlight into energy. The story of human development, of progress, is in many ways the story of our use of plants. Forget about bronze or iron. It's our mastery of plants that have allowed us to become the species we are today, to multiply to over 7 billion, and to change the planet so dramatically. And now we also ask of plants, through their ability to capture carbon, help in repairing this planet. Every single day on this journey, it's plants that have nourished us. For most of us, though, these connections, these dependencies, as profound as they are rather unemotional. But we do have an emotional connection to plants. And you only have to see even a handful of the pieces at the State Library of Queensland's current exhibition, Entwined, to realise that. Today I'm joined by a terrific panel, people who are going to help me explore some of these connections to plants, the form they take, and where our artistic and scientific relationships with plants are entwined. Our speakers are Dr. Laura Skates, botanist, artist, award-winning science communicator based in Perth. Her research focuses on carnivorous plants. Dr. Prudence Gibson, a research fellow in the School of Art and Design at the University of New South Wales. Her research and writing explores how visual and performance art can help change our perception of the vegetal world. And joining me here in the State Library is Dr. Tanja Beer, an award-winning ecological designer and community artist at the Queensland College of Art, Griffith University. Welcome to you all. Prudence, I'd like to come to you first. You're an artist and you're in the School of Art and Design, and yet much of your work is engaged in what even we as scientists considered kind of a musty and archaic aspect of our relationship with plants, a herbarium. Can you tell us, what is a herbarium and what was it intended to do?
Musty. No. No, herbaria are secret places. They're really mysterious. The Sydney Herbarium, which is part of the Royal Botanical Gardens here in Sydney, for me is a really special and beautiful place. So if you can imagine corridor after corridor after corridor of shelves full of boxes, and you pull out each box, and each box has these wonderful folders full of specimen sheets. And on every single specimen sheet is a dried and pressed plant collected, mostly from around New South Wales, but all around Australia and around the world. So the Sydney Herbarium has 1.4 million specimens, and each one of them tells a really fascinating and vital story. And it's interesting that you should say sort of musty and sort of stuffy, but for those of us who love archives and understand the joy of discovery, they're anything but musty. And the thing of particular interest about the Sydney Herbarium is that it's actually a really live collection. So unlike some of the collections that I've worked with in the past, such as I used to work in the Art Gallery of New South Wales and had to take care of the drawings collection. But unlike those slightly more inert collections, the herbaria around Australia and the Sydney Herbarium are constantly used for genetic research, for ongoing, very dynamic research. They're constantly being pulled out and absorbed. And there's so much data on each specimen sheet, which gives really valuable information about where each specimen was collected, who collected it, what those habitats were like when they were collected, and how things have changed. So in terms of climate change and in terms of changing biodiversity, these collections are really, really critical.
Thank you. And yet, Prudence, they clearly have a very contemporary scientific role, but part of your work is using art to give it almost a broader contemporary role in society too. What is that role you're seeking for the herbarium?
Yeah, so the project that I'm leading at the moment is an Australian Research Council project. And my job is to test how art and narrative can kind of revalue the collection. So if you think of those 1.4 million specimens as being worth sort of $280 million, for instance, which they are, but they also have, as you say, this really important kind of opportunity to do DNA testing and so on. Like, all of that information on those specimen sheets builds a really important story. And as you say, those musty shelves, etc., it's kind of hidden away. These are sort of secret, special, mysterious places that aren't as easy to access physically as some, other areas of vegetable life. And so I wanted to work out how art and narrative could reactivate as well as revalue the collection in Sydney. And so my project involves two major artworks. One is out at Mount Annan at the Plant Bank location, and one will be down at Bundanon Trust. And then I'm writing a book about the herbarium and all these amazing stories, all the botanists and horticulturists and conservators and all of that kind of really interesting field experience and knowledge, and also the stories of the plants themselves. Your introduction was really interesting about, plants, what they mean for us. But a lot of my past book, The Plant Contract, was about, well, how can art and narrative actually show us how the vegetable world has its own very agented and independent life, and maybe humanity is completely and utterly irrelevant to that story.
Thank you. And Tanja, I'd like to come to you now, because you're also working on, through artistic expression, advocating for a different relationship with plants and the arts. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what eco-scenography is?
Yes, sure. So I guess my background originally is as a stage designer and performance maker. And I started thinking about sustainability and how I could integrate that into the performing arts about 10 years ago. And one of the thoughts that I had was one of the first ideas that I had to create a sustainable set design was to build a stage of plants. I was an absolute plant novice at this point, but I had a lot of aspiration and a lot of energy, and found some plant whisperers to work with me, and that essentially became the living stage. And the living stage is a recyclable, biodegradable, edible, biodiverse performance space that combines community engagement, horticulture and stage design. So quite a lot to think about there. But essentially, we invite the community to come and grow the stage. We then perform in the stage with the community. It's all about the plants. The plants are the performers, the divas of the show. They really take centre stage, and in many ways we are celebrating plant life. And then in some aspects we eat the stage, or the produce from the stage. And then the plants get then distributed back out into the community. But I guess part of that project is, and the idea of eco-scenography or ecological design for performance is about really advocating for the love of nature and bringing nature and culture together to celebrate. I think celebration and love of plants, bringing that to the fore is what my work is all about, and often in the co-creating process. So the idea is that the community is growing the plant life and learning about gardening. For me, as someone who came into sustainability with not a lot of skills, who started the living stage with very little skills in understanding plants and gardening, I feel like gardening is often our first way to become more sustainable. Because if we look at the way plant systems work, it's so cyclical and everything has a reason for being there. When the plant dies, it becomes nutrients for the soil, and then the new seed seeds the new life. And if we can be more of that in our life, then we're moving towards a much more sustainable and thriving future.
And was that your own journey of kind of eco-literacy that you were just describing?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, I'm probably a really good example of someone who says, I don't even know where to start with plants, and that yeah. I think I've always advocated for plants. I've loved plants. I haven't been very good in the past of taking care of them. That was part of my journey in doing the living stage. And I partnered up with permaculturists, actually, who are, I call them plant whisperers because they really understand what a plant needs. And it's amazing how they could, by touching the soil and just looking at the plant and observing it in a particular way, they would know exactly what that plant needed. And I would say, how do you know that? Like, I know it's not happy, but I don't know what to do. And I think a lot of us who keep plants often feel that way, but the only way is really to start, and to start that process. I've certainly got a lot better along the way.
It's interesting you talk about that, learning about what plant needs and kind of how individual plants are, because even as a scientist, as an ecologist, someone who's worked a lot in restoration, it still stuns me just how individual plants are. One of the things we see a lot in restoration is that individual tree that you got the seed from can make the difference about whether the subsequent generations survive or not. Some trees are just better mothers than other trees, and that kind of individual nature is not something I ever expected to encounter in plants.
I feel like plants are like people. I really do. This is the whole conversation about plants and people, but I do feel that I also, through the process of spending time growing a plant, I have a connection to it. It feels like part of my extended family. That I think there's a sort of love of plants that we as humans, we innately have. So it's, in many ways, what my work is trying to do is bring that to the fore, to really advocate for that care and that love for, our extended family, which includes, includes the plants. And they are really the divas of the show. So often my performers, the performers that are performing on stage will talk about the plants being their co-performers, that they're co-performing with the plants. And the plants need a lot of care. I once toured a living stage design in Scotland, a tourable show, which meant touring the plants around Glasgow. And a very challenging project. We had plant doubles because some plants needed, because Glasgow is very cold even in summer, very windy, it's difficult weather. So we had to actually take plants back to the polytunnel, basically where they could be, have some respite, have some relaxation, and then take the other plants out and swap them over. So we had plant doubles, yeah.
Sort of like the artist's van for the plants.
Exactly, yeah.
And Laura Skates, I'd like to come to you now because you also share love of particular kind of plants. So there are carnivorous plants. Can you tell us what a carnivorous plant is? And I think the audience is going to see a picture of quite an exquisitely beautiful one from Western Australia at the moment. And so you could talk to that.
Yeah, so carnivorous plants, they're really fascinating. I'm sure most people might think of like the Venus flytrap with its little kind of snap trap mechanism, but there's actually around 800 species of carnivorous plants worldwide, and the one you should be seeing on the screen is a kind of sundew or a drosera, and these ones have this amazing sticky leaf trap. And I guess for a basic definition of what a carnivorous plant is, they are plants that use these specially modified leaf traps to capture and digest and absorb nutrients from prey. And I guess that's the thing that really fascinates me about them, is that they're really kind of turning the tables on what we think of a normal food chain sort of situation, and yeah, eating anything from a little fly to a huge dragonfly to even sometimes small mice and things like that.
They are rather exquisitely beautiful, this one in particular. And I wonder, some people in Queensland and in other parts of the world may have been out and visited some of our Great Barrier Reef islands in Australia, and there's a wonderful tree on some of those islands called the Pisonia tree, and one of its strategies for getting enough nutrients in this sort of desert of the island on the Great Barrier Reef is to trap birds that land in big birds, noddy terns with these sticky leaves. And it was always interesting to me to see how upset people got about birds, animals being trapped by a plant. And I wonder if there's something really unsettling for people about the idea of a carnivorous plant. I think of so many sci-fi characters when it's a plant. 70-80% of the time it's a carnivorous plant. Is that something that unsettles people?
Yeah, definitely. I guess for a long time, carnivorous plants have been thought of as these very monstrous kind of creatures. Obviously, there's like Audrey 2 and the Little Shop of Horrors, and the Day of the Triffids, and even things like the piranha plants in Super Mario and Victory Bell in Pokemon. So they're often depicted in that really kind of person-eating monster kind of way. And yeah, I think that they do kind of, I guess, mess with our idea of what a plant is, because often people might think of plants as being really still and gentle, but in reality, a lot of plants are having these incredible adaptations to survive. And it's not just carnivorous plants, but there's like parasitic plants out there as well, and there's all sorts of different ways that plants are being really sneaky to, get the nutrients they need or to survive in a really difficult landscape. So I don't know, I think that they are a bit scary, but they're also really fascinating.
Yeah, and I imagine that kind of personality that carnivorous plants have helped your fascination and dedication to them. Prudence, I'd like to come back to you now. You've said in the past that we have a rather colonial attitude to plants. What do you mean by that? And is there a way to decolonise our relationship with plants?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. This is a big question, and it's sensitive and it's difficult. It's really complex, but the herbaria are a good place to start talking about this issue, I think, because, the herbaria collections are such a rich kind of, archive and collection of data. It's not just about the plant pressed on the page, but it's got, stamped and written information and handwritten. And so what becomes really interesting when we're looking at these kind of archival collections is actually what's absent from these stories. And it soon becomes clear that these kind of collections of plants, and even the way we still name plants using that Linnaean system and classification or ordering system, using Latin names, it's very Eurocentric, it's very white male-centred, and I've heard lots and lots of really interesting stories about female botanists who weren't able to name plants for all kinds of reasons. And then probably the most important thing is the absence of Aboriginal information in these collections and on these specimen sheets. And so I think, even though this collection is kind of as culturally rich as the biodiversity that it protects, I think it's really interesting to start looking for those pieces of information that actually bring the story back together. So I'm not suggesting that we go back to pre-colonial times and imagine a world that used to be at all. Like, I don't think that destroying the colonial system or structure of naming can be changed, but we can certainly start trying to hear diverse stories around plant life and particularly for me around the collection. What are the Indigenous stories here, and who gets to tell them, and how can they be? How can we hear more about those kinds of stories?
Yeah, it seems that there's a lot of untold stories in our plant collections in general. And one of the things I want to come back to you now, Laura, is that plant illustration has been such a key part of plant science for such a long period of time, and they are beautiful in their own right. And the State Library here has many terrific illustrations of plants that form part of the impetus for the Entwined exhibition. I guess I've got two questions for here. One is building on what Prudence said. Those illustrators were often women, and this was a way that women could be involved in botany when they weren't allowed to name plants or be kind of the lead scientist. Are there heroes for you in this regard, people whose name we should know?
Yeah, definitely. There's a few that come to mind. I suppose one of them that I'll mention would be Marion North, although she's very famous, very well known, but she painted a lot of incredible images of flora in their natural landscapes, including many carnivorous plants. I think there might be an image of it, I'm not sure. What I really loved about the kind of work that she was doing was that she was painting these carnivorous plants in their natural landscapes and really showing that they're not just these botanical oddities on their own, they're actually part of an entire ecosystem. And that's something that's really important to me in my work, because I think that often, we do think of carnivorous plants as just these predators, but in reality they have all of these different ecological roles other than just capturing prey. But yeah, she's definitely one of the inspirations for me in my work, but there's many others. Another one that I could mention would be Mary Treat, who actually corresponded with Charles Darwin about carnivorous plants. So Darwin is obviously well known for the theory of evolution and that sort of thing, but he was also fascinated by carnivorous plants. And at the same time as he was writing this book, Insectivorous Plants, There was this woman, Mary Treat, in New Jersey, who was conducting all sorts of amazing experiments with carnivorous plants native to that region, and understanding them and illustrating how they work. And I think that, her letters with Darwin back and forth really show the amazing contributions that she made to that early carnivorous plant science. And I first came across her name just by reading a footnote in Darwin's book on the insectivorous plants, and then found that there was all of this incredible work that she'd done as well.
It's so interesting that you mention how the paintings of Marion North are sort of in context, because you're right, so often when we see scientific illustration, it's just on a white page. And, I can immediately imagine, as someone who's worked a lot in Borneo, the kind of even the scientific value of seeing the landscape around the plants, the things that she was seeing at the time. And so just for the listeners, in case you want to look those up, those names again were Marion North and Mary Treat. And one more question for you on this, Laura. Oh, sorry, we're just getting, that's better. Sorry, some feedback. These are really beautiful. Were they seen as art or science at the time, or both?
I guess both. I mean, I think that the artistic botanical illustrations are so integral to a lot of the science that was happening in that time. Obviously, before photography came along, illustration was the way that we were able to document what these plants look like at different times of year. But even in saying that, you can get a lot of accuracy, I suppose, from a photograph, but getting the skill that it takes to create a botanical illustration, to really, that person really needs to understand, how does this leaf come out of this part of the plant, how does this flower emerge? It's a whole really scientific understanding of how the plant works to be able to accurately depict it in an illustration. Definitely both, they go hand in hand.
Excellent. And just for the listeners, in about 15 minutes, we're going to be opening up the line for questions. And so at the end of this session, we'll take a little Q&A with the panellists. If I can come back to you now, Tanja, you work a lot with performing arts, and I guess as someone who's not in the artistic, almost the antithesis of an artist, I have seen plants and sustainability be a strong source of inspiration, and sustainability be a strong concern in fashion and visual arts and graphic arts. I'm not familiar with that in performing arts. What's been the reception of the performing arts community to your sustainability and plant-focused relationships?
I think it's that you're making an interesting point, because I think the performing arts has been a bit slower to take up the sustainability baton. I think because theatre is a very humanist kind of discipline. It's very focused on the human experience. It's been traditionally, at least in sort of the Western world, something that's been focused on the human, and at sometimes at a cost to the environmental components. However, in the last 10 years, we've seen this real surge of sustainability, interest in bringing art, culture and the environment together. And if we think about it, in ancient cultures and in First Nations cultures, nature and culture are not separate. We didn't evolve with nature and culture being separate. They were one and the same. We had our dances, our ceremonies, our rituals that were often around the seasons, were often integrating culture and science together. It's really only a recent phenomenon in our human existence, if you can think about it. So I feel like we're coming back to that. I feel like theatre is having its moment now, where it's like, yeah, cool, let's bring nature back in on stage, whether that's an outdoor theatre production that is really connected with its local environment, or whether it's indoors and it's using digital mediums and other ways to kind of augmented realities to kind of highlight the natural world. I feel like we are really absolutely having a moment, which is very exciting. And so, yeah, a lot of my work in the last 10 years is about really bringing that to the fore, and I guess starting to kind of get that sense of theatre and nature being intertwined with one another. And I'm interested in new aesthetics for the stage, where we can celebrate our sustainable practices, we can celebrate our connection to nature. And I'm excited about what's going to come, because I feel like we're just at that point now where lots of things are going to change.
Well, it must be satisfying to see that change, and a good time to be an eco-sonographer. Laura, can I come back to you now? People don't often think about plants being threatened, but through your work, you've seen plants that are threatened with extinction, and sometimes because of our interest in them. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship with plants? And I think we have a picture of one of the plants.
Yeah, so the picture that people will be seeing now will be of the Albany pitcher plant, which is a really incredible species. It's endemic to the south coast of Western Australia, so it's not found naturally anywhere else in the world. And it's a really special little carnivorous plant. And this is just one that's a really good example of the ways in which our plants can be threatened in numerous ways. So because this one only occurs in this small part of the world and it lives in swamps, it's affected by things like climate change and altered fire regimes, but it's also affected by people more directly in terms of things like poaching. And so, I mean, when we hear the word poaching, we might think about things like rhinos and elephants, but it happens to plants as well. And unfortunately, you do sometimes see when you're out in the wild that there are amazing plants and places where people have gone and dug them up, which is really disheartening for me as someone who is, I remember the first time that I actually saw these plants in the wild and just being so mind blown by the fact that they could even exist, that a plant with this kind of amazing trapping leaf was real. So yeah, for people to go and dig them up is really upsetting. And it's one of those things where, yeah, it's partially because of the fact that we're so fascinated by these plants that they then become threatened as well. And I would hope that by understanding a bit more about these plants and how special they are, that we can hopefully lead people away from that kind of thing. And one of the examples with this Albany pitcher plant is that it's not just a carnivorous plant, but it also has another ecological role, which I think is really cool. There's a native fly which actually completes part of its life cycle inside the pitcher. So the larvae are laid inside the pitcher into the digestive fluid where they grow and develop, and they eat other prey that the plant has caught, and then when they're grown up they're able to hop out of the pitcher. And without these pitcher plants we wouldn't have this amazing native insect species as well. So there's all of these amazing relationships between carnivorous plants and other species, not just predator-prey, but also pollinator relationships and digestive mutualism relationships and all sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's something where I hope that when people go and see these amazing plants in the wild, that they appreciate how incredible they are and just keep them happy in their habitat, really. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a surprising relationship with plants in some ways, this collection from the wild. The organisation that I work for runs conservation projects around the world, and we see a great deal more poaching of plants than of animals. Cactuses in Central America, or carnivorous plants, and orchids. There's lots of places we work where orchids are almost gone from the wild. In many cases, because social media has led to photos of rare orchids being circulated and posted and their locations posted. And yet it's probably not the intention of gardeners who love orchids to decimate the wild populations of them. Are there any things that people can do to make sure they're not decimating our rare and amazing carnivorous plants of Australia and other places?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it can be a really tricky thing with plant poaching because obviously, sometimes it happens that someone has just posted a lovely photo and then it's led someone else to go and do the wrong thing. I mean, I guess the main things are that you are seeing these plants in the wild to do the right thing and make sure that they're able to stay happy in their part of the world. But also, if you are interested in growing carnivorous plants at home, then there's lots of ways, I guess just being mindful of where you source your plants from, making sure that they are coming from, nurseries where they've been cultivated and not just from potentially someone that's dug them from the ground. So, yeah, but it is tricky.
Yeah, so being mindful of plants that have been grown for that purpose of being part of our gardens and our collections rather than traded from the wild. Yeah, Prudence, can I come back to you now? Because as a conservationist, I guess the growth of plants is so associated for me with ecological restoration and healing ecological wounds. You see a great deal of potential for artistic expression in that sort of restoration. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So I'm also part of an eco-activist group called the Dirt Witches, and we're a group of about 68 women. We're all artists and writers and curators and academics. And we recently, in January this year, we were able to get a City of Sydney grant to build an Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub forest in the middle of the Sydney CBD. And the Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub is a really endangered scrubland. So there used to be 5,000 hectares all around Sydney, and now there's only 120 left. So it's really devastating. So we built this beautiful Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub, and we've got native bees as well, and it's just been a really interesting process because as a group, 6 of us of the 60-odd Dirt Witches built it together. And it's really been interesting to kind of work out how to explain and activate that space as an artwork. And I think the best way to think of it is this idea of kind of mimicking nature, which is what we humans do, rather than thinking of plants as like people. I see it as the opposite way around, that we really need to start mimicking plant life. And by creating or mimicking plant life in this way, we're sort of creating a copy, which then is a really sort of affective or really emotional way to re-look at plant life, to sort of put it over there and then go, oh, there it is. What does that mean? And to just remind us of how plant life are the backbone to all life, and to just remind ourselves constantly of what's important. And I see that as a very, very political and imperative role of art.
Yeah, so the healing of ecological wounds is also sort of a pathway to some social repair as well.
Yes.
It's something that I'm sort of acutely aware of, particularly as we talk about plants and forest in an urban environment, is a serious, often social justice issue that creeps in. And we're perhaps not as familiar living in wonderful green spaces like Brisbane, but in many parts of the world, the least access to that kind of green space, the interaction with plants, are also the poorest, most disadvantaged parts of cities. And sometimes even those plant spaces hold a great deal of fear too for people. And I guess I wonder if you see in Australia, any kind of parallels in terms of how plants can help with social justice issues?
So the Royal Botanical Gardens have a community greening arm to their programs, and they have over 900 community gardens around New South Wales. And there are the most amazing young men running those programs. Like, they are so inspirational. And one of them's Phil Petit. And they go out to these communities, and you're absolutely right, Eddie, like there's that connection between social justice and environmental justice is really interconnected. And so they are really careful to go to these communities who are really wary because they don't want to see things fail, and they're wary about things being stolen and, torn down, etc., etc. And so what the RBG greening community people do is to go out to these groups and say, what do you want? What do you need? And how can we help you? And so I think that that's a really fantastic program to attend to exactly what you're talking about, this idea of being disconnected from botanical gardens or from florists or from beautiful, domestic gardens that some of us are lucky enough to enjoy.
Yeah, and I guess going to you now, Tanja, on the performance side, is that something that the performing arts is conscious of, how the types of audience that it's reaching?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually really thinking that we don't often make that comparison between environmental justice and social justice enough. We often put the environmental issue over here and the social issue over there, but they are so intertwined. And actually more and more we need to think socio-ecological, because otherwise, we're thinking that the environmental problem is something that can be solved separately to the social problem, and actually when they come together they can create incredible benefits. So the Living Stage project, it is a social justice project as much as it is an environmental justice project. It's all about engaging people from all walks of life. And in the greening of urban spaces, we did a project in New York on the Lower East Side of Manhattan that was a very highly urban space. We basically worked with a whole bunch of seniors who had very little access to nature. And the whole point of the Living Stage was to bring nature in and celebrate nature with the seniors and the local neighbourhood, and bring people of different walks of life together. And plants are amazing at that. They're really this conversation starter, because there's something about plants that gets people excited, and it is a kind of a neutralisation point in the sense that in terms of the maybe different politics that might be at play, if you get a whole bunch of people to do some botanical crafting, and I love to sort of build in some botanical crafting in the making of Living Stages, it is amazing how it just opens up all these boundaries and biases, and suddenly you have like these incredible conversations that are opening up through this touching of plants and weaving things together. And this idea of making something together as a community around nature and with plants. It's just like the double, it's like the double whammy. It's like the two awesome things coming together. I think we have to think more like that. I think social justice has to be at the heart of environmental justice. It's got to be one and the same.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true as we're seeing so much more research coming out about the healing value of being around nature, in a very clinical fashion too, the way it affects our bodies. And we were able to see a lot of that during the lockdowns last year as well. And it would be a tragedy if that access to that healing ended up becoming a social justice issue. I think we are now going to be able to take some Q&A from the audience. Laura, are those questions coming up? Oh, here we go. Perfect. They're coming on the screen in front of me here. Okay, this is a question from Laura, and I'm going to send it to Laura. And it's an anonymous question, but it is from Laura. Can you give us an example of a plant or a landscape that has fared well during COVID-19, and why might this be?
Oh, very good question. I'm struggling to think, I guess, but I feel like I've heard about how there were various places around the world that because there was less people driving and things like that, we had less, air pollution and that sort of thing. I'm not sure. Does anyone else on the panel have an example coming to mind?
This is more anecdotal, but I remember how in lockdown, that dogs were having the time of their lives because their owners were around to care for them. So I guess I'm making some sort of, idea of maybe the house plants were also having a good time because they were also well looked after, because you're looking at your plants every day and noticing when they need a bit of love and a bit of water. It's more of a general answer, but one to think about.
Yeah, so the landscapes that are fed well are our gardens and the places we see frequently.
If you were lucky it's interesting because I think if you were lucky to have a garden, then you spent as much time as you could in there because you couldn't go very far. And if you didn't have one, then you were nurturing the plants inside your house, or hopefully going and getting some more plants because you realised that you needed more. You needed to bring nature in.
Yeah, I spent a great deal of time in my garden during lockdown. This is a question from Kate, and I'm going to direct it to Prudence. Do you remember the moment you first fell in love with plants or understood their significance in your life?
Yes, I've been obsessed with a very, very unpopular plant, and it was used as a hedge at the front of the home where I grew up, and it's the lantana, and I love lantana, and I've written several papers about it, and I know that there are so many people out there who are going, no, kill the lantana, get Prue off, but it's such a beautiful, it's very woody, the leaves are kind of rough and sort of actually quite sharp and horrible, but it attracts so many butterflies and small birds, and I just have always loved those little flowers because if you twirl them, all the little colours merge together and make one colour. So I would say as a very young child crawling around trying to find a ball and hanging out in the lantana is definitely something that started my interest in plant life.
Yeah, and that is going to be an unpopular answer with many ecologists out there, but I sympathise with you. Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned birds because that's something that we have found is that small birds do very well in lantana. It's very hard for predators to get birds through a lantana thicket. And I do think in general we sort of often have a slight resentment to species that thrive in our domain. We almost like species that we've brought to the edge of extinction or we feel whose control is completely in our grasp, and lantana is not that. So I wonder if that contributes a bit to our dislike of it. This next question I'm going to direct to you, Tanja, maybe to start. I love mini biodiverse forests, popularised by the Japanese botanist Akira Miyawaki. Can you talk about why people's small actions can eventually make a difference?
Well, there's a saying to say that nothing happens from nothing, right? So every little thing helps to create something bigger, but and something more substantial. And we have to take the small steps, and those small steps become bigger steps, and so forth. But I think what those small actions do, and in a community context where we're doing botanical crafting and we're learning about biodiversity, for example, while we're crafting and we're getting our hands in the soil and we're learning about the plant and actually caressing the plant as we're making these botanical crafting artifacts, is that there is a sense of hands-on action and doing, and these small things also help us as humans to feel like we're moving towards a more sustainable future, this sense of hope, this sense of resilience. And that also helps us to move forward to be more sustainable in our own lives. So I feel like we do need the small, hands-on, tangible things to help us move forward. Otherwise, it just feels like it's all too big. And I think these sustainability problems, the problems that we have facing us, climate change, biodiversity issues are so huge, and just feel so impossible that, you know, you've got that starting with something tangible like watering your garden and seeding a plant is something that can, is really, really important in terms of driving change and driving hope, because it's your one small garden becomes many small gardens, becomes a community, becomes a city. And again, what I think all of us have been talking about, the way that plants and life cycles, if we understand the way that plants move in a life cycle system, we appreciate that cyclical way of being, then we become more, hopefully become more cyclical in the way we do things as well.
Yeah, it's good to be reminded of things that are in our control that can feed into a bigger system. This question, and it's just disappeared, but I think I'll get it right. It's from Samantha. I'm going to send it to you, Laura, given your work on a particular kind of plant, but it's a tricky one. Can plants be considered sentient beings?
Ooh, very interesting question. I mean, I guess with the carnivorous plants, they're often thought of in that way, although really I think what's going on in terms of carnivorous plants is that they're just responding to stimuli. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I think I'd have to look into it a bit more, but maybe.
I think, you know, that's been, certainly from an ecological point of view, one of those ideas that has gone from being incredibly fringe 10 or 20 years ago to being accepted almost, that there is a great level of communication between plants that we never anticipated before, and shows a depth of sort of awareness of the environment around them, and an awareness of the other plants, of their own species and of other species that are there. So I think we are becoming aware that there is a level of sentience almost to plants and forests as units that it was certainly considered a bizarre idea when it was first raised. Here's a question from Jen, and this is going to come back to you, Laura, because this is a perfect one for you. Do you think that soils in Australia are getting better or worse, and what is the impact on plants and plant diversity?
Great question. Well, I guess in terms of, when I'm thinking about carnivorous plants, part of the reason why so many have evolved in Australia, and I'm not sure if I mentioned, but we have about a third of the world's species of carnivorous plants in Australia. And part of that is because, especially in Western Australia, we have such ancient soils there, so old that so much of the nutrition has leached away. But I mean, we are impacting soils in so many ways, whether it's through the fertilisers that we are adding onto soils, or by affecting the water tables, by, when we chop down trees and the water table rises and salinity increases. I suppose that soils are being really affected by our actions, so but I'm not really sure. Which direction.
It's a great question, and certainly that's something as a conservationist we're deeply concerned about. The soils were part of a sort of a neglected part of the our Earth systems, and we're getting increasing awareness of how integral they are to the diversity we see above them. So, very astute question. Let's have a look here. Here's a question from Emily. Do you believe there's a lack of training or funding available for Australian taxonomists? And is the current number of undiscovered species a concern? Prudence, you interact with people that care a great deal about classification and taxonomy of plants. What do you think?
Eddie, can I just respond to one of the other questions quickly first?
Of course.
Possible?
Yes, please do.
Just that question of plant sentience, because, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about, this idea of plant sentience being just something you believe in or not. But the truth is that there are some, really fantastic figures in plant science, such as Monica Gagliano and Suzanne Simard, who have done this really kind of groundbreaking laboratory work with plants to prove that plants not only learn, but they remember and they associatively learn and they communicate through gases and emissions of chemicals and through the mycelium underneath the ground. And so, we no longer have to kind of dance around those questions in a way. So because there's been so much fantastic proven work on plant behaviour. So we now know, maybe the language is a little bit uncomfortable, but plant sentience is not really something that we have to be uncomfortable talking about anymore. Oh, and sorry, to answer the other question, which was just about kind of funding for botanical research is, and a lot of research, not just in Australia but everywhere, is kind of dismally low. And, particularly in this epoch of climate change and mass extinctions, the more that botanists and taxonomists can have, the better. It's really, really critical work, because how else can we work out what to do in terms of fire-resistant planning, etc., and heat planning, unless we know what's there and what's changing. And, like Plant Bank out at Mount Annan do all this amazing work testing seeds under different temperatures. But I would just take issue with one point, which is this idea that there are all these plants that are undiscovered. We have to just remember that when we're talking about discovery, it's a very Western notion of discovery, and that First Nations people around the world are already, very, very vitally aware of a lot of plants that we can come along and discover.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Plants, animals, it's same all around. And certainly, I guess to build on that, there is a lot of plants that are still undescribed. I think I'm always astounded at how many of my botanist colleagues have lists of plants that in their lifetime they have scientifically described for the first time. And so it's probably a part of ecology that I'm surprised that rate of discovery hasn't tapered off as much as it has, given they don't move around very much. A couple of other questions here, and one is related to naming. So I'll stick with you, Prudence, just for this one. This is from Anonymous, and it says, yes, great to include Indigenous names, but does the naming of plants have a role in their accessibility and understandable and being understandable all over the world?
Yes, no, 100%. And that's what I was saying before, that, for instance, any kind of processes or procedures or strategies of decolonising would be only about tri-naming, which is, Latin name, common name, Aboriginal names. So building on the knowledge and the systems and the archival information and data that are already there. So that question is 100% accurate. I for one wouldn't want anything to change. Like, I think it's really legitimate to have a global process of naming and classifying and ordering and so on.
Yeah, and I can see that there's another question here for you, Tanja. Ecosonography. This is a wonderful term. I agree. When speaking to you, was the first time I'd heard that term. Is there a book that people can go to? And I feel like I'm setting you up here for something.
It's funny that you should say that. So my book on ecosonography is currently at the publishers and should be out later this year. It's been published by Palgrave Macmillan. It's called Ecosonography, An Introduction to Ecological Design for Performance. It's got lots of really great examples of theatre makers and designers and artists doing awesome stuff with plants and nature and all things sustainability from around the world. It also includes illustrations from my wonderful sister, who's a graphic designer. So it's very visual, as well as lots of juicy stuff to get your head around. Yeah, that will be forthcoming, hopefully before the end of the year. Thank you for asking. Get to plug the book. Thank you.
No, and you know what? The same could be true for everyone else here. There's questions that I won't read out individually, but I would encourage all the authors, all of the audience to go and look up each of our panellists tonight, because some of these questions are, where can I find out more information about the dirt witches? And questions about Laura's plant illustrations. So please do go and look up each of our panellists after this. We've come to the end of tonight's conversation, and it's been a great pleasure for me, really enjoyable to speak to three people who are all scientists and artists, which is a brilliant combination that we need to see more of. And I think some of the topics that we've been able to explore because of those dual skills that you guys are bringing to your professional pursuits is indicative of why that's such a fruitful area. I would like to thank the Conversation and the State Library of Queensland for holding these two, and Auslan, and the Auslan interpreters who are just out of screen, who you can't see. They're from Deaf Services Queensland. Thank you, and please watch out for the next partnership event between the State Library of Queensland and the Conversation. Thank you.